And tonight, her talk's going to explore first the Colorado River, looking at connections between natural biogeochemical processes and management practices that affect our water. And then she's going to look more to the urban systems and water in the city and talk about how the water benefits that come from our lakes and aquatic systems, how they help people. So thanks, Hilairy.
Thank you, Ramon. That's a very nice introduction. So I'm so happy to see you all here tonight. I think this is going to be a really, I'm hoping that you kind of get the impression that I'm taking you on a field trip and that we're going to explore a little bit about water in Arizona. And before I forget, I do have to say thank you both to my lab and to my field geochemistry classes, because lots of the data you see today was collected by my students. So I'm going to talk to you about water in Arizona. But first I'm going to start, I'm just going to allow us to be a little compelling about water itself. Water, like religion and ideology, has the power to move millions of people. Since the very birth of human civilization, people have moved to settle close to it. People move when there's too little of it. People move when there's too much of it. People journey down it. People write, sing, and dance about it. People fight about it. And all people, everywhere, and every day need it. This is Mikhail Gorbachev. And I think Gorbachev got it right. Water matters. Water is fundamental. So I'm going to take you on a field trip. I could introduce myself and tell you about all the science that I do and about what I've done before. But really, I think what we're going to do is I'm going to take you someplace pretty, and I'm going to tell you what I see when I'm in this environment. And I'm a chemist by training. I see rocks, I see water, I see plants. But I also look at this and I realize that the water and the rocks are interacting with each other, that the plants need the water. And then I look a little closer, and I see that these rocks are covered with algae. They're green. And when I see that, then I see oxygen. That photosynthetic algae is making oxygen. It's using nitrogen. And I remember that I'm a chemist, and I see evaporation, and I see all kinds of processes happening. And so I hope as we go through this talk that I'm going to give you some idea about why those processes are important, even if they're not the things you think about every day when you go out to a river. My lab is the Carbon and Nitrogen Dynamics Lab, and we study carbon cycling in aquatic systems, as Ramon said. In particular, we like arid land ecosystems because we live in Arizona, and it turns out they're really important. And I do work in hydrothermal systems, but I'm not going to talk about that today. And again, this is here to remind me to thank my students and my classes. And I'm also particularly going to thank Ramon tonight because he made some of these videos possible at the last minute when things were not working for me. The reason we study carbon and nitrogen cycling is because they're important to tell us about ecosystem services, and I'll talk about that a little bit more, that these environments provide for us. So a bit of a roadmap. I'm going to talk about water in Arizona. We're going to have a little chemistry lesson. You probably didn't really think you were going to get a chemistry lesson today, but it turns out it's going to happen. We're going to talk about dissolved organic carbon, why we care, and what it can tell us. And then I'm going to tell you a story in 3 parts about carbon cycling in Arizona, particularly as it relates to rivers. So we live on a water planet. This is not surprising to anybody, but I think it's also really important to occasionally step back and take the planetary view that most of our planet is covered with water. 70% of the surface has water on it. Only 30% are the continents where we live. And so it might not be so surprising that the part we know best is not the water, but the continents. So my oceanographic side says, 70% water, this is excellent. But in reality, as people, it's that fresh water that we worry about. The salt water is most of it, of course. But the fresh water is the big deal. Now, unfortunately, of that fresh water, almost all of it is locked up in ice, in the polar ice caps. And that's great, but it's not actually something that we can get our hands on very easily. The water we actually interact with most is surface water, lakes and rivers, and groundwater, since we live here in Arizona. And that's only about, in very round numbers, 1% of all the water on the planet is fresh water that we can get at. If you want to get technical, the atmosphere and the biosphere have water associated with them, but these are tiny, tiny fractions of percentages. So why rivers? Rivers are actually big players in the global carbon cycle. Even though rivers are a really tiny fraction of the amount of water on the planet, the amount of carbon that travels through rivers is quite big. So here's the atmosphere. It has a lot of carbon in it. It increases every year by about 3 gigatons of carbon because we're producing carbon dioxide. And some of that carbon gets taken up by the land, and some of that carbon gets taken up by the ocean. You'll notice this number that's going from the land to the atmosphere is a big number. That's 6. A lot of that 6 ends up in the oceans, which is convenient. But if you'd ask somebody how much carbon is traveling down rivers, people would usually say it's a small number. Well, it turns out it's about 0.7 in these units. And if you look at them in round ways, that's a number close to 1. That's a number close to 1. It's comparable to the amount of carbon that's being moved from the atmosphere to the land or from the atmosphere to the oceans. I want to unpack this arrow with its approximately 1 gigaton of carbon. These rivers are not just pipes. They don't just move stuff from the land to the ocean and that's that. Stuff happens along the way. There's different sources of carbon. There's different processes that change it. And I would put it to you that we need a different arrow, right? We have an arrow that says water flows off the landscape. Maybe it picks up carbon. Maybe it goes through a reservoir where there's a dam. Stuff happens in that reservoir. And then once it gets through the dam and goes downstream, it then transports carbon to the ocean. So we can't just imagine this as a sort of like a straw where water comes from the landscape and goes to the ocean. We have to think about what happens to that water in the rivers while it's being transported. That's kind of big picture, why should we care? If I go to a river and I'm standing there looking at it and I wear my biogeochemistry hat, I think about carbon. My favorite element, as people will probably figure out by now. And I worry about the dissolved part, but we could talk about particles. But for today, we're going to talk about dissolved stuff. And I can see this, I look at this river and I say, oh, there's landscape that has plants and soils and things like that. There's terrestrial input to the system. And then I look at this river and it's like, oh, this river isn't exactly clear. It's kind of brown. There's a lot of carbon that's actually in the water. Some of that carbon is produced by algae that live in the water, so there's aquatic input. And then I realize all that dissolved organic carbon, whether it came from the plants or it came from the microbes, is a big mix of material, and that makes it complicated. And so hopefully we're going to unpack this complicatedness a little bit. All of this plant-derived carbon, microbially derived carbon, contributes to this idea of water quality. What is it that makes water, what is it that makes a healthy ecosystem? So we'll get to that too. Let's take a little bit of a perspective. How much carbon are we talking about in rivers? Is it a lot? Is it a little? Well, it's always kind of a relative question. We're going to talk about the amount of carbon in rivers, and we're going to think about it as milligrams of carbon per liter. And that's chemist speak. There's no getting around it. This is a little bit less than a liter. And a milligram of organic matter, if you dried it down in your hand, is pretty small. Maybe a pinch of salt or so. It's not a lot of material. But remember, rivers, especially big rivers, have a lot of liters associated with them. But the units that we tend to compare things in are these milligrams per liter. So here's the Amazon, one of the big rivers. Pretty much everybody's heard of the Amazon. It carries about 4 in these units. The Mississippi, one of the biggest rivers in the US, highly influenced by agriculture, gets about 8. The Yellow River in China and the Indus in Asia, these are 2 rivers that have lots of particles associated with them and a lot of organic material, and they get numbers up around 12 or 16. This paper from 1991 is actually one of the most recent compilations of this material. And so when I was looking at this, I remember thinking, because I'm studying Colorado and I'm interested in arid land systems, they're not saying much about arid land rivers. One of the closest examples they had was the Columbia, which runs through eastern Washington. It's got about 3. It had no data at all for the Colorado. And there was a single line that said, semi-arid regions generally have lower carbon. And that's about it. And this led me to realize that there's a lot we don't know about rivers in arid lands. And there's a lot we don't know about medium-sized rivers. We know a lot about little tiny streams because they're easy to study. We know a fair amount about really big rivers. But kind of medium-sized rivers, and the Colorado is a big medium-sized river, but we'll get to that. We don't know very much. So water in the desert is a beautiful thing. And I don't mean that in any kind of snide way. Actually, aesthetically, it is beautiful. And it's a good thing because we use a lot of it. Right now, kind of best estimates in Arizona, we use about 7.8 million acre-feet of water each year. An acre-foot, not an SI unit. It's an area of an acre, which is a little smaller than an American football field without its end zones, and a foot deep. So it's a fairly large area, and it's a foot deep, so that makes it a fairly large volume. 7.8 million acre-feet a year. Of that 7.8, we'll call it 8, about half comes from surface water. And by surface water, I mean rivers. And if you look at those rivers, about 3 of it is coming from the Colorado, and a little bit more than 1 is coming from the other rivers like the Salt and the Verde and those guys. We also, in Arizona, use about 3.4 million acre-feet of groundwater each year. This number is a little hard to pin down. If you go to the ADWR webpage, they say it's a number that's a little bit more like 2.7. If you go to the University of Arizona, which is where I got this data, they say 3.4. Needless to say, it's a lot, right? 40% or so of the water that we use. And we do use a little bit of effluent water, but it's a pretty small percentage. Though that percentage is growing, and that's reminding me to tell you that this idea of water supply, how much water, and water quality, how good is that water, are intimately related, right? As water supply goes down, water that maybe didn't have pristine water quality and would have been good to use or mentally good to use suddenly becomes better because there's not as much water around. How many of you have been to the Colorado River? How many of you have never been to the Colorado River? How many of you have been down in the canyon of the Colorado River? Okay, so not so many. Courtesy of the National Park Service, I'm going to take you guys to the Colorado River for a while. The canyon is spectacular. The canyon is also really big. And what I hope you get from looking at this is that this river has done a lot of work over a long time. But the other thing I hope you get as you look at this, what color is the water? Grayish brown. There's stuff in that water. Are there ecosystems around this river? Yeah, there are trees and riparian zones, and maybe they don't climb up the hill slopes very far, but there's a lot going on here. They say it's one of the 7 wonders of the world. I think they're probably right. But the other thing to remember is that this is part of the lifeblood of our state. Everything about the Colorado is important for us. But it's not all the Colorado. There are other places with water in our state. This is Grand Falls, which is on the Little Colorado River. And this little inset map, here's the Little Colorado River flowing into the Colorado up here. Here's Phoenix, just so everybody knows where we are. When I see this picture, I see weathering. I see water interacting with rock, eroding minerals, and providing inorganic elements to the downstream system. This is the Verde River. The Verde River is in central Arizona. It flows from here up above Paulson, down meets the Salt River just outside of Phoenix. The Verde is beautiful. It has fabulous riparian zones with trees and plants. And you go there and you sit and you stand beside it and you're kind of surprised that you're in the middle of the desert. But when I look at the Verde, I actually see our water supply. This is some of the water most directly linked to Phoenix. And when I think about it as part of our water supply, you know, you ask the question, well, is it nice? It's beautiful and it's clear. Well, that's psychologically helpful. But it turns out the Verde has a very healthy ecosystem. All of the things that add carbon to the water are balanced by things that remove carbon from the water, and it doesn't have very much carbon in it at all, actually. And I'll show you some of that. It's not just it's not just rivers. There are lakes in Arizona. 3, technically. One of them is Marshall Lake up here next to Flagstaff. It's a very shallow lake. Some years it's almost dry. It has an incredible amount of organic sediment sitting in the bottom of it, and it's a great home for migratory birds. But I look at it and I see it's almost tea-colored. It's got lots of dissolved organic material that came from vegetation. Back up. I missed my joke. Monica will laugh at me. Lakes are a big deal. We're not Minnesota, right? We don't have 1,000 lakes. We have 3. Unless you count our reservoirs, and we have lots of reservoirs. The reservoir nearest home is actually Tempe Town Lake, right here in Tempe. And Tempe Town Lake is man-made. This picture leads you to believe that Tempe Town Lake is actually quite attractive. It's not bad. Right now, it's a little dry because they're draining it, but we'll get to that. But infrastructure, constructed environments, are very much a part of the way we think about water, right? We need water every day, and we have figured out ways to get it. And we're not the first ones to do this here in Arizona. In fact, people have been controlling water in Arizona for a very long time. So this is a historical sidebar. I think these things are important now and then, even for scientists. The Hohokam were here controlling water in Arizona a long, long time before we ever got here. So this is a map of the Hohokam Canal system during the period sort of 300 to 1400 AD. And so on this map, here's the Salt River coming through what is now Phoenix. Here's the confluence of the Salt and the Gila. Here's the Gila River. It starts out in New Mexico, comes through central Arizona, comes up between the Santans and the Estrella Mountains. And the Hohokam lived in this region, had tremendously well-developed agricultural communities, and they depended on canals and diversions. And all these lines here are estimates or actual mappings of where the Hohokam Canal structures were. And their systems had main channels and secondary distribution lines. They were very well-developed and complex water distribution systems. And if you want to know more about this, you should go to the Pueblo Grande Museum on Washington Road, because it's really, really cool. So 1,000 years or more ago, people were thinking about water. And in fact, they did a really good job. Such a good job that, in fact, the Hohokam Canal system and the modern canal systems are in the same places. So if you look, and I'm sorry, this isn't the greatest resolution, but all of these gray lines, remember here's South Mountain again, here's Camelback, all these gray lines are where the Hohokam Canal systems were. All these orangey lines are the historic canals that were put in for agricultural purposes when Phoenix was first settled. And all the blue lines are where the modern day canal systems are that you can go and ride your bike along. It turns out the prehistoric peoples did a very nice job of figuring out where to put canals, how to put them in at the right sort of gradient to get water to flow where you wanted to. It's not unusual for people to be manipulating their environment in the service of water. We still do it. We build reservoirs. We build a lot of reservoirs. And so here's a map of Arizona, and it has all the big rivers on it. And what I really want you to see are all these little red lines. All these little red lines are dams that have been constructed at various times. There are dams on the Colorado River, a lot of them, some of our biggest ones. There are dams along the Salt River, a whole series of them leading into Phoenix. There are 2 dams on the Verde River that are notable. Remember, I'm going to put the Verde River into my story as we go on tonight. Here's the Gila River. It also has a series of dams. And the Little Colorado, which I showed you, Grand Falls, which is up here somewhere. And I highlighted these watersheds mostly so that you can see how much of the state, and this is a cartoon, obviously, of the watersheds, we're trying to kind of have some control over where the water comes from and goes to, but also to sort of give you the first idea that you can see that this is what we think of as a nested system, right? The Verde leads into the Salt, and the Salt leads into the Gila, and the Gila leads into the Colorado. Water is interconnected. Keep that in mind. So we control this water. One reason we control water is flooding. We have floods. If you're new to Arizona or you're young, we don't think about them all that often, but we can have very big floods in Arizona. This is a picture of the Gila. It's not a new picture. And it has sort of a braided channel, and it's got agricultural land all around it. And I use this picture because it has a very nice companion picture of the Gila in flood. And so here's the Gila channel. And the pictures are sort of the same scale. You can see the ag fields are about the same size. But look at how far away, and the ag fields are, turns out agricultural fields are also sort of like a mile by mile grid, very much like the way the city is built. This water is extending way far out into the agricultural land and up into these washes. These big floods are really, really problematic, right? They mess up agricultural land. They put water where you don't want it. They make a mess. And so what do we do about it? Well, we build dams, lots and lots of dams. These photographs, this is just sort of a little tour, are some of the smallest ones. So here's Bartlett Dam on the Verde. I think Bartlett is beautiful. I love that they built this complicated multi-arch structure. This is Mormon Flat Dam on the Salt River. Not all dams are big concrete structures. This is the Alamo Dam on the Bill Williams River, and it's actually an earthen dam, still doing its job just fine. One of the first dams built in Arizona is the Coolidge Dam on the Gila. And the thing I like about this picture is actually, if you look carefully, there is beautiful architectural stuff associated with this dam. When this dam was built in the 20s, it was the height of the Art Deco period, and they decorated it. People felt that this was sort of the human endeavor at its greatest engineering sort of capacity. And so many, many of our dams are actually well decorated and quite lovely because people recognize the import of being able to manage water. We have big ones too, right? Here's the Hoover Dam on Lake Mead. Hoover Dam also has beautiful sort of 1920s decorations. And another big dam that maybe people don't see as often is Roosevelt on the Salt River. This is Roosevelt Lake, and this is the big dam. This is the other main drinking water supply to the city of Phoenix, is the Salt River. Oops, sorry. So, taken me 15 minutes to get to the big question. We've seen all these reservoirs. We've seen beautiful pictures of water. I think I've compelled you to think that biogeochemistry is an interesting way to approach looking at a river. But really, the fair question is, why do we care about carbon in rivers? So this is a picture of Lake Mead. I was standing on Hoover Dam, looking back at the lake, with my field geochemistry class, actually, and was talking with them about the bathtub ring, right? It's sort of an iconic picture right now of water in the West. There's this big reservoir. It's a huge reservoir, and yet the reservoir is, this is on order 150 to 200 feet of water that's not here. At one point it was, right? In order to get this bathtub ring, you actually have to water above, you know, in contact with the rock, and it's mostly a carbonate sort of precipitation. But it tells you that a lot of water was there, and now that water's not there anymore. And so if you look at this, the first thing you realize is that we have a water supply problem, right? This reservoir is there for storage, and we're storing way less water than we probably anticipated. This gets back to what I was saying before about water supply and water quality. If water supply is down, which clearly, at least in terms of Lake Mead, it is, there's less water available. And if there's less water available, then we have to start to think about what is the nature of the water we have left. Do we have to start thinking about water quality that isn't quite as high as the Colorado River? And I'm not saying there's anything wrong with the water in Lake Mead at this stage. There's not. But it does make you sort of stop and think about water is scarce and we need to worry about it. And so I'm going to tell you a little bit more about carbon and why understanding carbon in rivers is important for understanding the health of our ecosystems and the quality of our water. So ecosystem services, it's a big word. It's gotten a lot of press since the Millennial Ecosystem Assessment. If you boil it all down, it's benefits that humans obtain from their environment. And people work to maximize the benefits they obtain from their ecosystems in many times that is by constructing infrastructure, right? Those dams are beautiful examples of infrastructure. Water provides tremendous numbers of services. It provides clean water for drinking, provides us with water for agriculture. We recreate, right? We have boats. It's aesthetically appealing. And these are kind of the obvious services. But there's more happening than meets the eye in the water. Remember I said I go out into the field and I look at a stream and I look at the algae and I see chemistry. Biogeochemical processes, interactions of biological processes with rocks and the chemistry of their environment also provide services. So I'm going to tell you a little bit about how we can think about biogeochemical processes. So this video is not looping quite the way it's supposed to, but I think I can get it to go once more. Oops, maybe not. We rely on biogeochemistry even if we don't think about it. So this is an incredibly rich algal mat. Photosynthetic algae, water flows over it. It's absolutely spectacular to look at. And while I can't quite get my video to run the way I wanted to, see the bubbles? These bubbles are not because the water is rushing over rocks and being mixed turbulently. These bubbles are oxygen being evolved by the algae. These photosynthetic algae are taking up CO2 from the atmosphere, and they are making oxygen, which is the oxygen we breathe, and they're making organic matter, in this case, biomass. All of this rich algal material is organic. What you can't see as easily are all of the microbes that are also eating organic matter. Just like you and I eat organic material, there are bacteria that eat organic material, and they turn that organic carbon back into CO2, and that's the global carbon cycle. But those processes are deeply connected to water quality. And I could talk about a story about oxygen and nitrogen and phosphorus and all of these other nutrients and trace metals. But I'm going to kind of try to keep the story simple. We're going to talk about carbon, organic carbon. Carbon is essentially currency for microbes. We worry about who's got money and who's making money and who's spending money. Microbes worry about who's got carbon and who's using carbon. It's the only chemical equation for the night. If you read this equation from left to right, carbon dioxide and water in the presence of a plant will make organic carbon and oxygen. If you prefer to read this equation from right to left, oxygen plus organic carbon in the presence of a microbe will produce CO2 and water. That's respiration. And so these are my happy microbes. For purposes of this talk, we can just assume that they're all happy, cheerful, lovely little bugs doing what they do. Some of them are taking up organic carbon and giving up CO2. Some of them are taking up CO2 and producing organic carbon. So do we have a kind of microbial view of the world right now? Good. That carbon, that organic matter, turns out is an extremely complicated soup of many different kinds of molecules. How many of you had organic chemistry? How many of you liked organic chemistry? Me too. So I look at the background, which you've noticed I've faded out into a very like non-invasive, non-threatening suite of molecules. And I see things that are aromatic and look like they came from trees. And I see things that look like they might be related to sugars and DNA structures. And it's supposed to be a gemisch that doesn't actually mean anything to you guys, but it sets the stage. And I'm picking this word dissolve because I'm interested in all those organic things that will actually stay in the water, right? Oh, right. Carbon. For those of you who've not had chemistry, who has forgotten most of their chemistry? Okay, so carbon. It's a fabulous atom. It has 6 protons and 6 neutrons. It's the 6th most abundant element in the universe, and it's the stuff of life, really. It comes in an organic form, or sorry, an inorganic form, CO2 and carbonate and eventually limestone. There's a lot of what we see in the Grand Canyon. And it comes in organic form, little tiny molecules, big complicated molecules. I'm interested in the smaller scale stuff and the things that will stay dissolved in the water. And it's because those are the organic molecules that are the currency for microbes. So there are 2 important questions about carbon. And my chemistry colleagues will forgive me, but there are only 2 questions. How much? What kind? That's all you need to know. So I'm going to let you guys think about how much and what kind for a second. Imagine a cup of coffee. You have a picture in your head? Does it look like that? It could. But it turns out you don't actually know much about this. You might know where it's from, something about its source. It comes from Starbucks. You might know about how much you have. This is, I think, I don't know what the size is. I think it's a large. But that's all you know. My husband will tell you that coffee in to-go cups is uncivilized, and you should always sit down and drink your coffee. And if you did that, you would know something about your coffee. Some of you probably imagined a beautiful cup of strong black coffee. Some of you probably imagined coffee with steamed milk and maybe some sugar in it. Some of you probably imagined something in between. But now you suddenly know a whole lot more about what kind of coffee you have that you couldn't see before. And not all coffee is the same, right? Some coffee is sweet, some coffee is bitter. If you like your coffee black, this looks terrible. If you like your coffee sweet, this looks pretty good. If you're thinking about it as a microbe, it's a question of quality. Some stuff is bioavailable, or what I would call tasty, or chemically it's reactive. Some carbon is not so bioavailable. It's inert or degraded, or what you might call stable. One way to think about it is that the coffee, in this case, the horrible sweet thing with caramel on it, is the nice, juicy, reactive organic matter. And the cup, which is also made of paper, it's organic, probably not such great food, right? Imagine you're sitting at a buffet with a bunch of undergraduates. If you're a microbe, you also have this same choice. There are all these different molecules out there that you could eat. What are you going to eat first? Now, you could say, they're going to eat a little bit of everything, and if I walked away for an hour and I came back, there would just be a little bit of everything left. Really, the undergrads would probably take down the pizza, then they would go for the chocolate, and if you left them there long enough, they would eat the broccoli. And if you left them there a really long time, you might get them to eat the fish oil, but they wouldn't be very happy about it. Microbes are sort of the same. They have organic molecules that they prefer and organic molecules that they don't prefer. So where we talk about molecules, we're really talking about things that are different compound classes, sugars or alcohols. There's no alcohol in that coffee. Protein, maybe fat. Well, it's St. Patrick's Day. I suppose if it was Irish coffee, there could be alcohol involved. We need tools to try to tell us something about what molecules we have. Turns out one tool we have at our disposal is fluorescence. Some molecules, but not all, if you shine UV light on them, will release a photon, and they will fluoresce. Not all molecules can do this. This molecule is aromatic, has lots of double bonds, which are in fact what we call conjugated, and this molecule fluoresces really well, and it actually fluoresces this green color. For those taking notes at home, this is fluorescein. This molecule, perfectly nice straight chain hydrocarbon, you shine fluorescent light on it, and it does nothing. So we can use fluorescence, whether or not it fluoresces and what color of light it emits, to tell us something about the molecule. So how do we do that exactly? It turns out not everything lights up bright green and is easy to look at. It turns out we need an instrument for this. And we do what's called fluorescence fingerprinting. So this is a plot of excitation wavelength, the wavelength of light that we shine on the sample, versus emission wavelength, the wavelength or the color of light that the sample emits when you shine light on it. And the vertical axis is intensity, so how bright is it? So if we shine light on a sample here at this wavelength and we measure a spectrum, we see that it has a peak here at about 450 nanometers. We could shine light on it at a little bit longer wavelengths, and we could take a spectrum again. And you'll see this peak sort of shifts to the left, and maybe it's getting a little shorter. You believe me? Okay. So if I keep doing that with a whole bunch of different wavelengths of light, you can see I've kind of built up this shape. It's like a topographic map. There's a big hill here and a valley in between and a small hill here. So this is beginning to be something that you could imagine as a contour plot. And it turns out that different regions of that contour plot are associated with different molecule types. So if you think about this as a topographic map, you flatten it down, you get a spectrum like this. So it's still excitation wavelength, the light we shine on it, and emission wavelength, the light that's being emitted. And now instead of having an actual 3D spectrum, the height of that peak is in color. And so this is the high peak in the front, this is the little peak in the back. Turns out these two regions are associated with aromatic material, stuff that is derived from trees, terrestrial stuff. This little peak over here is associated with protein-like material, associated with microbes. And remember I said this is sort of like the cup, and this is sort of like the coffee. So now we have a tool that's going to allow us to distinguish between terrestrial stuff and microbial stuff. So here's the plan. We're going to use this information about concentration, how much, and composition, what kind, to try to explore these processes that are happening in rivers. Remember, this is my cartoon of carbon coming in from the land, going through a reservoir, and being transported downstream. So it's a tale of three rivers. The first one is the Verde, this watershed in central Arizona that's one of our drinking water supplies. We're going to use the Verde River story to look at patterns in organic carbon. Okay? And then we're going to look at the Colorado. This is just the bottom of the Colorado because it's only a map of Arizona. And the Colorado project is going to tell us more about the processes that are behind those patterns. And then we're going to come back home to Phoenix and look at Tempe Town Lake, and we'll talk a little bit of both, pattern and process. And the other thing this is here to remind me of is I put Phoenix on there to remind us that Phoenix actually sits within these watersheds, right? We are part and parcel of the landscape where the rivers are. So the Verde. My first river in Arizona, I got here in 2003, and everybody said, what are you going to do? You're an oceanographer. I'm like, well, I'll study rivers. And I had a master's student who thought that was a good idea, and we sampled along this section of the Verde. Here's Camp Verde and Route 17. This is Horseshoe Reservoir. Here's Bartlett Reservoir, and Phoenix is down here. And we asked a simple question, how much carbon is there, and how does it change over time? So here's a plot. I've plotted dissolved organic carbon in milligrams per liter. Those are the same units that were in the table before, versus time. And so this is August of 2004, October, December 2005 is this panel here in the middle, and we got into 2006. And these are the upstream sites, the pink ones that were up by Camp Verde. And what we saw is that the amount of carbon in the river in the late summer was pretty low, jumped way up in our November sampling, and then it came back down over the course of the year, and it kind of flattened out again at this low concentration. These are numbers that are kind of between 1 and 2. And those, remember I told you the Verde doesn't actually have a lot of carbon in it most of the time. But if you compare the upstream sites with the downstream sites, you get a very different story. So all these blue ones are those sites that were downstream and below the reservoirs. You don't see this big peak in November. And you can see that these blue symbols are all higher than the pink symbols. Well, that's certainly a pattern, but how do you explain the pattern? Well, it turns out these samples, this is 2 sites in the upper portion of the river, were collected right after a winter storm. Lots of water rushed in, flowed over the landscape, probably carried in material from the soils. And the other thing is that sites below the reservoirs generally have more carbon than the sites above the reservoirs. Okay, well that's cool, but it still doesn't tell us much about process. Why? Maybe we can tell a story about the storm. But really what you can get from this data set is that carbon is variable at different times of the year in different years, that storms might have an effect, and that the reservoir might have an effect. Keep that in the back of your head. I've been here a while, I've got projects going on, and I decided that I was willing to tackle the Colorado. We did not work in this part of the Colorado. We worked in nice, quiet stretches of the Colorado. But it's a pretty good video, and I figured you should see it. So why the Colorado? Well, one, the Colorado is big, right? I'm an oceanographer. I am not afraid of kind of planetary scale science. And it has a watershed that covers something like 7 states. It's actually relatively understudied as rivers go, certainly from a biogeochemical standpoint. I think in part because it's a managed river and people sort of perceive managed rivers as being not the right thing to study because they aren't pristine. And it's right there. We live in Phoenix, and the Colorado is basically in our backyard. Okay, Rock Springs, Wyoming is not in our backyard, but parts of the river are quite close. It provides drinking water, hydropower, recreation. There are all kinds of reasons why this river is important. But for the purposes of this story, I'm going to tell you about some process studies that we did to try to understand how carbon is being transformed along the river. So we sampled from as far up in the river as Wyoming, all the way through this reservoir, down through Utah. We went through Lake Powell and Lee's Ferry, Lake Mead and Willow Beach, and all the way down to not quite as far as Yuma. So we covered some ground. And we did some work on tributaries up here as well. And one thing I want you to remember as we continue this talk is that the Colorado River was defined by people who maybe didn't think about hydrology necessarily as having an upper basin, which is everything upstream of Glen Canyon Dam, and a lower basin, which is everything downstream of Glen Canyon Dam. This river is fundamentally altered, okay? There is no question about that. Here's dissolved organic carbon in the river, again in milligrams per liter. Remember the Verde had values down here between 1 and 2. These open symbols are the upper basin sites. They're all from above Glen Canyon Dam. And you'll see that they have highs and lows and highs and lows, highs and lows, actually on a seasonal basis. This is data from USGS. This is September of 1995, 96, 97. In each winter, there seems to be a peak, probably due to snowmelt bringing stuff in from the landscape. But if you go to the lower basin, and these are 2 sites, one is at Lee's Ferry and the other one is down by Blythe, Colorado. There's no strong seasonal pattern here. The whole seasonal pattern has been damped out. That's a really interesting pattern. And we probably assume that it has something to do with the reservoirs, but it'd be nice to do some work to actually find out how that works. So I'm interested in processes, right? Remember, we have carbon goes up, carbon comes down. What makes it come down? A good question. Why doesn't it go up and down as high as it does in each? Why is it different in each year? These are all reasonable process questions. And there are lots of processes that can transform carbon. Evaporation, microbial stuff, sorption to particles. We're going to focus on microbial degradation, those bugs that eat carbon. And we're going to tell a little story about photochemical oxidation, which is that sunlight also breaks down carbon. We did 2 experiments. One that tries to look at photochemistry, take samples, put half of them in the light, half of them in the dark, put them on the roof of this building in the sun, wait 2 weeks, and then measure changes in concentration and changes in fluorescence. Okay? All the photo-oxidation experiments will have sunshines on them. We also asked whether bacteria want to eat the carbon. You take your sample, you put some bacteria in, put them in the dark, let the bacteria chew on them. At the end of 2 weeks, you measure concentration and fluorescence again to see what changes. So the hypothesis is that photo-oxidation is going to remove organic carbon and microbial degradation is going to remove organic carbon, but that those two processes are not going to affect the same molecules. Sunlight maybe isn't very fussy about what it breaks down. Bacteria maybe care a little bit. So we use fluorescence spectra to see changes in the amount of fluorescent stuff. Remember I showed you these fingerprints before. The top ones are before the exposure to light and after the exposure to light, and you can see really easily, very obviously, that the fluorescence material has been removed. If you leave them in the dark, nothing happens. It turns out, this is a plot of how much change we saw. The total carbon didn't actually change very much. We only transformed it into different molecules. But the aromatic portion really decreased rather extensively, more than we expected. And the protein-like material actually went up a little bit. I don't think anything was added to this. I think the thing is that if you remove, in a relative sense, some carbon, you have to have something that looks like it went up relative to what it was when it started. But basically, the thing to take home from this is that photochemical oxidation, sunlight, breaks down the aromatic stuff. When you feed it to microbes, and now this is bioavailable carbon, how much did they remove on a percentage basis? And these are from upstream to downstream. Microbes eat carbon, sometimes as much as 25% of what was in the bottle, sometimes only 5 to 10%, but they definitely remove organic material. The key question is, do they remove different organic material than the sunlight? So this is those aromatic components and the protein-like components. This is that percent change again. And the thing to take home from this is that all of these values are basically near zero. They didn't eat anything that was fluorescent. They didn't change the amount of aromatic material. They didn't change the amount of protein-like material. This is why I can say microbes are fussy. They definitely ate carbon, 25% of what was in the bottle, but they didn't eat any of the stuff that lights up under the fluorescence analyzer. Very interesting. So what did we learn? We just did a fair amount of chemistry. We know that in sunlight, DOC concentration doesn't change much, the dissolved organic carbon, the aromatic stuff goes down, and the protein-like stuff goes up. For bacteria, carbon definitely went down, but neither the aromatic nor the protein-like material changed. So if both those processes are going on someplace, you would imagine you would see decreases in carbon concentration, decreases in the amount that's aromatic, and then an increase in the amount of protein-like material. So the burning question is, does the river look like that? Well, fortunately, we went out and we collected a lot of samples. So here's where all the samples were. Remember, upper basin up here, lower basin down here. Here's the DOC concentration. Now this is plotted in distance from the river mouth, and it turns out this site up here in Rock Springs is about 2,400 miles from the mouth of the river. So here it is, or sorry, 2,200 kilometers. So this is the upstream side, this is the downstream side, and that dotted line goes right there. Carbon concentration went down along the length of the river. Aromatic material decreased along the length of the river, and protein-like material increased along the length of the river. And for the statisticians in the room, these are not so bad as R-squareds go for a big, broad, long-distance study. And more to the point, my p-values are lovely. These are real significant changes, which means the pattern that we see in the river does reflect the patterns that we see that are due to photochemistry and biology. That's pretty cool. So, last bit of this story. Valley of the Sun, right? Remember I said we were coming back to Phoenix to talk a little bit about Tempe Town Lake. It's one of the fastest growing urban areas in the country. And these maps, 1912, 1930s, 50s, 70s, 1995, show a decrease in the amount of the landscape that's covered by agriculture, the green, and a really tremendous increase in the amount of the landscape that's covered by urban areas. All of this urbanization, and you can see the rivers that are on these maps, mean that people are here and people need to interact with their water in lots of different ways. Tempe Town Lake is actually a really nice backyard project for me because it's right here next to Arizona State. It's fed by Indian Bend Wash when it's raining. The Verde and the Salt River are here, and it's actually sitting in the Salt River Channel. This is a zoom in on that. It has inflatable dams at both ends. That's in the process of changing. I realize that, but as of a month ago, this was still true. And I'm going to focus in on this area for a second. I want you to realize that there's water on both sides of this upstream dam. And I'm going to tell you a story about when the Verde River came to town. December 2004, they did a big dam release from the Verde. And this is that upstream dam. This is the lake. This is the the wetland that's built up on the other side. And you'll note this sign, which is about 3 feet above the surface of the water. And about 13 minutes later, 30,000 cubic feet per second water coming from the Verde over top of this dam, filled up 3 feet of water. This was a lot of water. They eventually actually lowered the dams and they allowed water to run through. I looked at it as a sampling opportunity. My student was kind of excited, and we actually sampled daily for all of 2005. So this is 2005 data. And what's plotted here is actually salt content, conductivity. And the thing you can see is that the conductivity is low during the winter months when the river was flowing. Then the conductivity increases rather dramatically through the dry season. Well, this is where they raise the dam. This is where the lake starts to evaporate. And this is the onset of the summer monsoon, where it rained a lot, and you can see the conductivity or the salt content was diluted. But we don't care about salt. We want to know about carbon. So here's that dissolved organic carbon, and suddenly we have numbers that are more like 6, a lot more carbon. After the dams are raised, carbon decreased really, really dramatically. Well, that's interesting. Inorganic stuff goes up, carbon goes down. The other thing we see is that carbon went way up at the beginning of the monsoon. You remember the last time we saw a big spike in carbon concentration in a river system? It was in the Verde. It was after that winter storm. So here's yet another example of where a storm event brings organic matter in. Where did we see decreases in organic carbon in a sort of steady way? In our biological degradation experiments on the Colorado. It's a pretty safe bet that biodegradation, or maybe photo-oxidation, or maybe both, are drawing down this carbon during the summertime in the lake. You think I stopped sampling in 2006? Now, we've been sampling Tempe Town Lake on a relatively regular basis from January 2005 until they drained the lake about 2 weeks ago. This is a fabulous time series. You can get a lot of information. It's the same plot. This is carbon concentration. This is time. Here's that big decrease. There's that summer monsoon. There's a time when I didn't have any students in the lab to work on this project. There's a time where it increased during the monsoon, decreased through the rest of the year. There's definitely some years where there's a lot going on. The dam break in the summer of 2010 was in there. And now we're sort of in this period where there's decreases during the dry periods, increases during the monsoons. This nice regular pattern. There's a lot of pattern here. This is great. It varies seasonally and interannually. Turns out there was a big change to the water supply right here. All of this period, there was wastewater or treated effluent from the Mesa Northwest treatment plant that got into Tempe Town Lake, and it carried a lot of nitrogen with it. And carbon tended to be higher and more variable. From this point forward, that water is now being sent someplace else, and carbon concentrations have been steadily decreasing, though with this sort of seasonal pattern overlaying on top of it. So I'm going to zoom in on just this portion here, so 12, 13, 14, and we're going to look at composition a little bit. That's what I do. And we're going to look at whether or not some of these sort of complicated patterns in carbon can be explained by processes. So here's those time series. This is January 2012 to May 14. Here's a measure of the aromatic material. And the bottom one, same time period, is a measure of the protein-like material. And now I'm going to remind myself to tell you that these purple lines are rainfall. They're coming down from the top because they look like rain. And what you can see is in some of the bigger rain events, there are increases in aromatic material. Here, here, here. This one actually is right there. This one's harder to see. The rain events are delivering terrestrially derived stuff from soils and maybe even trees, even to Tempe Town Lake. The same rain events are associated with decreases in the protein-like material here and here. This one is a clearer pattern, which suggests that that rainwater is diluting the protein-like material that's there from the algae in the lake. This is ongoing work. We're busy developing models to try to understand the inputs from rivers and from rainstorms on the composition and cycling of carbon in this lake. But that's ongoing stuff. Remember, this lake goes through some very strange behaviors, right? Most lakes do not get emptied and refilled on a regular basis, and they don't have rivers come and kind of recharge them with different water. All these blue periods are times in the past where the water was completely recharged with either from a river flow or from lowering the dams and refilling it. Well, right now the dams are being replaced, and I would like to know what happens next in this time series, but you'll have to wait till the next talk to find out about that. So, we care about carbon in rivers, and I picked this map at the end to sort of highlight the fact that you can see the cities and the roads and the fact that there are people in this valley, and there are going to be people here for a long time, and you can see the rivers. And let me tell you, it's really hard to find a map that has the rivers and the roads. But we care about carbon in these rivers because water in rivers are essential for us as a water supply. I hope I've given you some indication that biogeochemistry transforms carbon in these rivers and is therefore related to water quality. And by understanding our rivers and the biogeochemistry, it makes us better water users. So will you look at rivers a little differently the next time you go outside? I hope so. Thank you. So I realize I ran a little long, but we are going to have time for a few questions if you have them. Yes, and I think Rick's got a microphone, so.
I think all of the data you showed on the Colorado was 20 years old. Have you or others stopped studying that since that time period?
So the question is about the data I showed for the Colorado that was 20 years old. USGS actually has not been monitoring water chemistry on the same. They used to monitor water chemistry at a lot of sites, and those data from the 90s are from the USGS database. They still monitor flow and water level religiously, but there's not as much water chemistry data as there used to be, and I think that's a funding problem.
You showed there's many different types of carbon in the water. And I'm wondering exactly how it gets there. Is it that the plants generate it and then die and break down and give it off that way? Or are they actually emitting it, secreting it or whatever? That's a good question. So the question is about how does the carbon actually get into the water? Are the plants emitting it, or is it actually the plant material itself? There are a lot of different paths, right? Leaves can fall into the water, and bacteria can start to break them down and release some organic molecules, or they might just have some molecules in them that can dissolve if you give them enough time. Plants that are growing really happily, like algae that have all their nutrients and all of the carbon dioxide and the right temperature that they need, generally don't release much organic material. They can use it for their growth. But algae that are growing in sort of stressed conditions often sort of ooze out organic molecules because they don't have the energy or the nutrients to do stuff with them. So there's a lot of ways to get organic material in.
Yeah, Hilairy, for those chemicals, particularly in the heavily urbanized Tempe Town Lake, how many of those organic compounds have an anthropogenic source?
So the question is about anthropogenic or human-derived carbon in Tempe Town Lake. The short answer is some. The long answer is not as many as you might think. The carbon concentrations in the lake are down in the sort of 4 to 2 range, right? So they're not super high. Our lab focuses on natural organic matter and sort of things that would be conceived of as not exactly hair-raising. Paul Westerhoff's lab in engineering is actually looking at emergent contaminants and estrogenic compounds, and they also look at Tempe Town Lake, but they're measuring stuff that's actually really low concentrations. Remember, the water in the lake comes from the Verde and the salt and the Colorado River, so it starts out as untreated drinking water. It's also got a pretty healthy ecosystem. I didn't go into great detail about how the plants are growing and the microbes are using carbon, but it turns out there's lots of oxygen produced. It's a reasonably healthy ecosystem. It's got low nutrients, which means there's not a lot of, eutrophication or anything like that. The algae, the oxygen levels are high, which means the algae aren't dying and breaking down and all that organic carbon getting degraded and taking away the oxygen. So I won't say that they're not there, but the lake is not some horrible thing that people perceive it to be. It is a lot the same water chemistry if you went to, your Aunt Sylvia's farm in Minnesota and went to the pond on the back 40, and it had plants and stuff growing in it and a little bit of pond scum. You would swim in that pond because you've perceived it to be pretty nice. It's out in the country. But it's not a heck of a lot different from Tempe Town Lake. Nikita. That's my undergraduate. She's great.
I have a question about Tempe Town Lake. Do you know why they're draining it right now?
So Nikita wants to know why they're draining the lake. I do know. They are replacing the inflatable dams at the downstream end of the lake with a steel gate dam that is basically less likely to fail because of the sunlight. Remember, the rubber dam burst because the UV light broke down the material in the rubber. And so the steel gate dam will also be able to go up and down, but it won't wear out as rapidly as the inflatable one. Amanda.
Your data from the Colorado suggests that the dam, the Glen Canyon Dam, doesn't really affect the overall trends from the upper portion to the lower portion. In part, is that because the sunlight and microbes are working on different parts of the carbon system?
So that's an excellent question. She asks whether or not, says it looks, if you look carefully at my data, that there's not a lot of difference as you go past the first big reservoir, right? And so it's an excellent question. It's a question I hope that no one was going to ask because I set this up as a reservoirs matter kind of story. In the Colorado, what we see is that there are differences above and below each reservoir, but they don't change that overall upstream to downstream pattern. So one of the things we're trying to look at now is what do the small changes due to the reservoirs mean versus the sort of large scale, and I mean continental scale, upstream to downstream pattern. So I don't have a good answer for you.
There's a lot of discussion in the Verde River system regarding the future of that water supply, and of course also the Mogollon Rim forest and the fire implications. Would you give us perhaps an observation about what the future holds along the lines of water chemistry and carbon?
So the question is about the Verde has been subject to recent forest fires and changes in water supply, and I was asking whether if I had a crystal ball and could tell you what the future of the Verde was going to be like, I would very happily tell you that. I don't really know. Forest fires have been happening for millennia, right? And so the Verde has been perpetually experiencing
sediment input and soot input from forest fires. We haven't sampled the Verde directly in quite a while, but I shouldn't say that. My lab hasn't sampled the Verde, but I mentioned my colleague Paul Westerhoff, the water quality group in engineering does sample it, and they haven't seen dramatic changes in carbon at least. That doesn't mean there might not be changes in other parameters that are important for water quality, but it's a dynamic system. So, are there any other questions? Oh, one more. Last one.
There's a lot of consternation about lead in drinking water. I hope we don't have a source of lead that's feeding our water supply.
So,
so that's something that you have measured in your work?
So we have measured trace metals occasionally. We don't do it as part of our routine sampling. Certainly in Tempe Town Lake, the metal concentrations are really, really low. The metal concentrations in the Colorado are fairly low, and there aren't any natural sources of lead, big ones, to that watershed to worry about. But there are anthropogenic inputs that you might want to think about. Fortunately for people like me, we have SRP and APS who are very worried about our water supply, and we have, Phoenix is a major metropolitan area that has very well-developed water treatment systems. So we think about them, but at the moment, we don't have to worry about them. Thank you.
Another hand? I was just going to share a small anecdote. I did, maybe like other people, I swam a few races in Tempe Town Lake, and maybe other people do this, but I swim with my mouth open a lot. So early on, I would always be worried, like, what does it taste like? It tasted okay. It tasted like the, pond in Minnesota. So yeah, that's another reason why it matters. So anyway, let's thank also people who helped make things happen tonight. So Karen Valentines, Stephanie Germain, Cami Skiba, Rick Alling, and also Meg Hufford. So thanks to everyone for making things happen, and also Rick's assistance this evening. I want to thank everyone for attending tonight. We have next month another one of these great discovery lectures, and that'll be on April 21st, presented by Dr. Ariel Anbar, and it's going to be Life on Earth and Beyond, Present, Past, and Future. So make sure to come. We've got some nice brochures that are more information on this series, so something to, highlighting Hilary's work, and then two different versions of a kind of a nice CC brochure, and that also provides information for the Sun Devil Giving. So please be generous tomorrow, and we'll look forward to seeing you all in the future. Good night.
you.